Okay, good evening, good afternoon, or possibly even good morning, depending where you are. Welcome to Lacan in Scotland. And it's a huge pleasure to have Meera Lee with us here today. Meera is going to be talking to us about a feminine mode of love, perversion and the phallus, which I'm sure is going to be a very intriguing talk. The talk tonight is a sneak preview of Meera's forthcoming book, and echoes some aspects of the work in this absolutely brilliant collection, which Meera edited for the Power of Lacan series last year. So if you enjoy the talk tonight, check out the book and check out the forthcoming book as well. Without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Meera. Meera, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Calum, for introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. I am delighted to present my new work on perversion. So I just want to first give you a little background of this talk, how this came about. Calum just gave us a little brief information about it. So as I was reading Freud and Lacan for quite some time, in the past, there's something frustrating about it. So to me, it's unclear. There was neurosis and there was psychosis in both Freud and Lacan. There are somewhat clear formulations and definitions. But the so-called, the third structure, perversion, was not. And it was it wasn't really easy to pinpoint what perversion is in both Freud and Lacan. And they talk about it actually all the time. The word perversion, the word perverse appears consistently and quite throughout both of their works. So this frustration and interest somewhat whimsically got me to doing some collaboration. That's the fruition of that was the Lacan's Cruelty, the edited volume. And so I was very fortunate to work with many talented Lacanian scholars and clinicians. Then I thought I was done with perversion. I'm moving on. And so I have embarked on a new book project monograph, this time on the superego. And in this book, I explore specifically the question of what is a father? So I talk about two main fathers, prohibiting father and a permissive father. And I'm writing it. As I'm writing, I find myself returning to perversion, but this time from quite a different lens and a different perspective, and namely a feminine perversion. So this talk is a portion of the chapter of the book, my book manuscript, provisionally titled A Feminine Mode of Love, Perversion and the Phallus. So I'd like to begin by sharing a slide first. Right here. This word indicates metonymically the finer term, the term of suicide in which is expressed what is at stake in the young homosexual woman, this being the sole mainspring of her entire perversion. Namely, a steady and particularly reinforced love for the father. At the very end of 8th chapter of Seminar 4, Lacan makes these striking remarks in which he alludes to a certain link between perversion and feminine love for the father. What does Lacan mean by this? Lacan's endeavor to formulate perversion, by the way, this word refers to the German word niederkommen, the word in the previous paragraph. And I don't speak German, but this means to give birth and to fall. And I will return to this implications of it. And it's very important to formulation of my argument today. So Lacan's endeavor to formulate perversion is hardly satisfying, even frustrating, due to his lack of clear definitions. Cataloging perversion is a tricky business. Despite his persistent reference to perversion or the perverse throughout his entire career, it is true that I have noted, as I noted elsewhere in my introduction in Lacan's Cruelty, he never defines perversion in a clear manner, either as a fantasy and a structure, as he does with neurosis, through repression, psychosis, through foreclosure. Although I don't think this lack of definition is a really matter, but that's a whole another conversation. However, we can trace 4 moments of perversion in Lacan's opus. So the first moment is the triadic nod of the child, the mother, and the phallus. The second moment, which I wrote about in Lacan's Cruelty, is in his text Kant with Sade. The third moment is perversion as transgression as he moves on to his 7th seminar and onward. The fourth moment is in his late teaching on jouissance and symptom, namely perversion. In addition to this list, I would like to consider another side of perversion, perhaps even the other side of perversion, characterized as the feminine love for the father. This present talk, therefore, aims not to examine perversion in terms of clinical structure or diagnostic differentiation, but to grasp it in relation to the phallus and the feminine Oedipal fantasy. In other words, to consider another side of perversion, which I call a feminine mode of perversion. As paradoxical as it may sound, says Lacan, perversion can be best approached through female sexuality, for it is precisely located outside the phallus. Here we arrive at the axiomatic statement of the woman as the -5. It is also paradoxical because in classical psychoanalysis, perversion is attached to the man or the masculine image, not only through the discourse of the Oedipus complex, but also in the traditional diagnostic conception of the pervert as a male fetishist, for example, in exhibitionism or transvestism. However, for Lacan, the phallus as the leg is crucial to perversion, and in turn, perversion is important because understanding it is the most effective way to fathom the enigma of feminine sexuality. In other words, what is or what is to be woman. It is not by accident that Lacan takes us along the path of a female homosexuality so as to enlighten perversion at a time when his teaching was particularly concerned with the function of the phallus. But before I delve into my talk's main topics, I want to briefly mention Freud's essay, The Child is Being Beaten. I have the whole section in the book, but here I'm going to give you very, very brief, just the 2 points. So because here in this Freud's essay, I can see the trace of a feminine mode of perversion, actually first in connection to the feminine Oedipal fantasy. So the first point is this. Regarding the first, as you know, there are 3 stages in this beating fantasies. The first stage where Freud constructed this sentence, "My father is beating the child whom I hate." But Lacan reconstructed the sentence as follows. "My father is beating the child whom I hate for fear that I might not believe that I am the favored one." So beating in this fantasy is a demonstration of the father's love. The second point that I want to make is the third stage of this fantasy. And for Lacan, the third stage is the most important one because here the specific phantasmeric narratives are reduced to the generalized speech, "A child is being beaten." This reduced statement is a remainder of the primordial fantasy, namely Object A. To elucidate on feminine fantasy, Lacan takes us through Freud's 2 famous case studies of young female patients. The first, the case of the young homosexual woman, and subsequently the case of Dora. Much as Freud took female homosexuality as a point of departure for his clinical formulation of the former patient, young homosexual woman, for Dora as well, though in a notoriously belated manner, female homosexuality is also the reference point in Lacan's thesis of perversion in his 4th seminar. What is more pronounced in Lacan's formulation is his refinding of a certain structure fundamental to the problems of both the young women, namely the dialectics of love. Dialectical love in Lacan's term is not ascribed to any sexual orientation, either heterosexual or homosexual, but rather the phallus, the image of the erect penis, namely semblant. When Lacan uses the term phallus, he refers precisely to the leg of the phallus, the -5. Lacan says in his text, Science and Truth, quote, the phallus itself is nothing but the side of leg it indicates in the subject, unquote. The phallus is therefore, quoting Jacques Lemaitre, a signifier of this leg in being. In his lecture, Signification of the Phallus, Lacan points out that as clinical cases have proven, the question of the phallus is more difficult when it comes to women. In Analysis Terminable Interminable, and Freud in that essay talks about already the relation of the phallus and woman, returning to what he calls, quote, the repudiation of femininity, unquote, as concerns the end of analysis. There remains what Freud calls a phenomenal residue, one that psychoanalysis cannot overcome due to the striving to masculine. These are Freud's words. And this is concerned to both men and women, not just to men. Here, Freud already formulates implicitly what Lacan does, the phallus as the unattainable qua the leg, and the experience of femininity as feminine jouissance. The question of this complex relation between the phallus and the female subject becomes even more challenging when the clinical cases reveal that little girl wants a child from father. Lacan's hypotheses here are not a novel aspect. It's not novel or even anything new in both the theoretical and clinical domains. Nevertheless, another aspect is his condensation of Freud's theories of the phallus and female beating fantasies or feminine masochism into the concept of the signifier under the minus anatomical side, sort of taking the libidinal economy out of it. From this perspective, it is not by accident that Lacan situates the problematic of the phallus within female sexuality, or more specifically, feminine perversion. So the next section, the premise of the father, the young homosexual one. So a beautiful, bright 18-year-old woman from a well-regarded family in Vienna, who, according to Freud, did not seem to exhibit any sign of hysteria or troubles growing up, is brought to Professor Freud by father. The young woman had begun to develop a certain kind of Freud said passion for a much older lady who was, as Freud put it, a certain society lady. The passion the girl showed for the lady manifested in a particular manner of love, one typically cultivated by a man to a woman. This masculine love, in Freud's words, especially irked the father, who seemed to care greatly for the daughter. Eventually, the father brought his daughter to Freud to bring her, quoting Freud, back to a normal state of the mind, unquote, after her unhelpful suicide attempt. In formulating the case of the young homosexual woman, Lacan establishes three specific phases organized around the father. So phase one is the father can give me a child. Phase two is the father gives a child to the mother. Phase three, the lady is a substitute for the child. So the young woman used to care deeply for a child between the age of 13 and 15. She was affectionate toward a toddler, the little boy of family friends. She adored the little boy so much that their friendship grew and lasted for some time. Her exquisite tenderness indicated the good qualities of and passion for maternity. What does her desire for motherhood mean in terms of her dialectical relation to the father? Her pronounced affection toward the child is in Lacan's reading, translated into, my father can give me a child. So this is the phase one. But when the young woman receives her own message in an inverted form, and Lacan says that we all do this, right? We all take our own message in an inverted form. So she hears from the father as follows: you will bear my child. And it is a desire that is fully unconscious. The question is why the girl wants a child. Why does she need to invent a child? Lacan's theory of the phallus's function in relation to castration addresses this question. Having realized during her adipose stage that she had been deprived of the penis, the girl experiences the fundamental frustration originating in castration that ultimately prevents her from having satisfaction. At this level of the absence or the minus of the penis, she imagines having a child with a father, the object that fills her void. In the case of the young homosexual woman, a real child involves the child of the family friend she was looking after. What the child represents for her is the phallus, that is the imaginary penis, and to bear it, the subject places herself in the position of the imaginary mother, and as a result, the function of the father is reduced to the purely symbolic. This is the first phase. Lacan places the whole drama in an L-shaped diagram, namely the first schema of the young homosexual woman. Here is the first schema right here. So you can see the symbolic father and imaginary penis and real child here. This is a more primitive schema that was prior to these more sophisticated ones later on. Something dramatic happens to the young homosexual woman at the age of 18. She falls in love with a lady, which designates the third phase, and I will turn to the second phase. But this love is a peculiar one. What makes a love distinctive or homosexual is the highly stylized way, which resembles traditional male courtship rituals directed toward women, in which the young woman cultivates her affection for the lady. Her object choice for Freud, quote, corresponds, therefore, not only to her feminine, but also to her masculine idea, unquote, which qualifies her as a homosexual woman. For Lacan, the young woman's devotion to the ladies, however, defined less a form of homosexual love in the conventional sense than adoration or courtship in heterosexual love rituals. What is happening in the phase 3 is an inversion of phase 1. So here's the second schema. The young homosexual woman begins to identify herself with the father. So here's the ego. She takes the position of the father by Freud's words, keeping his penis. This identification suggests a transformation at two levels, which are not mutually exclusive. On one level, her ego is turned from the imaginary mother into, here, imaginary father, holding the symbolic penis. Hence, the absence of the symbolic father in the second schema. On another level, as a consequence of the first schema, the lady is a substitute for the child. You can see the real child is substituted by the real lady. So the lady is a substitute for the child, namely the object A, a formulation that stands in stark contrast to Freud's interpretation of the lady as a substitute for the mother. At this moment, the permutation of the object to object A takes place. Lacan points to this imaginary mode of being of the young homosexual woman as the very moment of the culmination of her perversion. The perversion he formulates in this context is the inverted permutation of the position of the father from the symbolic to the imaginary through ego identification rather than the object identification. Thereby, the penis becomes a purely image with no libidinal values. In the case of the young homosexual woman, the feminine perverse fantasy of childbirth is rooted in phase 2. What then happened in the second phase? What happened between the girl's tender affection for the child in phase 1 and her falling in love with the lady in phase 3? A major event that Freud did not miss, the birth of the another child in the family. This incident was so fatal to the girl that she attempted to commit suicide. It was around the occasion of the mother's giving birth that the young woman's tender love for the child disappeared suddenly. So her maternity has disappeared at this point. She began to cultivate a highly sophisticated love for the lady. Again, the question is why? Why did she all of a sudden develop a new strange behavior? What does the mother's giving birth have to do with this? Jealousy immediately comes to mind. It is not presumptuous to state the young woman envied her mother's giving birth, especially it was the father who gave her that object of desire. The jealousy is, however, unconscious. So, for example, it's not exactly the same as the schoolgirl competition jealousy, which is conscious, because it is rooted, this jealousy is rooted in the unresolved Oedipus complex. And Freud remarks here that what she desired was her father's child and an image of him. That's Freud. All along, the daughter had believed that the father would give a child to her and no one else. The mother was no exception, because she was so sure of Lacan's word, the promise made by the father, again, possibly not known to her conscience. Her disappointment or even her sense of betrayal was significant. Out of her frustration, she turned her love to the woman. And concerning this reversal, Lacan draws our attention to Freud's interpretation of the young woman's dreams. Without the slightest hesitation, he states, Freud was wrong about her dreams, where she finds a man and marries him. So this dream is here, meeting a man and marries him, is associated to having a child. That is Lacan's reinterpretation. Lacan says that her dreams were only the reassertion of the father's promise to her, which is giving a child, her inverted message, you will bear my child. Moreover, what happened in her dreams, Lacan says, should have been taken as the most hopeful outcome for the young lady. In reality, however, the father gave a promised gift to the mother. And this incident brought back to the girl her childhood Oedipus complex, as Freud notes. Subsequently, his ferocious, perhaps even despicable glance at her triggers her deep Oedipal feeling of betrayal. Precisely after seeing her father's angry look, she attempted suicide, an act that Freud calls niederkommen, the German word that means to give birth, and that the act that Lacan describes as a fall. How does suicide signify a childbirth? In the footnotes, editor James Strachey explains that in Freud's word of the German word niederkommen, there is the play of the word. So it means to be delivered of a child or to fall. But in the colloquial German, he also explains it means to fall. And to fall means pregnancy or a childbirth. Stretch also notes that in psychoanalysis, it is quite common that suicide implicates a sexual fulfillment. What eventually led to the young woman's suicide attempt is the object that caused her frustration, the child. More precisely, the lack of the child. To her, this void meant the lack of the father's love. Her suicide attempt is a fall whose imagery invokes giving birth or means a sexual fulfillment. It was a perverse metonym of childbirth niederkommen. The young woman's suicide attempt was therefore, as Lacan says, the passage to the act, the solution to the despair. Her passage to the act had a specific aim. As Lacan reaffirms Freud, her passionate affection toward the lady was therefore nothing but her revenge on the father, who failed to give her a child. Her vengeance has two meanings, therefore. At the real level, by openly and publicly loving the lady in a masculine manner, she intends to hurt the father. At the symbolic level, in so doing, she shows to the father how to love. So we can also think about Lacan's savoir. Her passionate love for the lady, or homosexual love, is therefore a demonstration of the love the father failed to give her. Her demonstration of love is to protest the father's breaking the promise. But what is it that is loved in her homosexual love, Lacan asks. The young woman loves the lady precisely for what she cannot give her, the child. Her desire is beyond what her love object can give, the phallus. Thus, she wants this nothing marked by the lack of the phallus. So she wants the nothing. It's like what Lacan says about anorexia. Anorexia, it's the nothing. It is this inversion of love in the dialectics of absence and presence, or having not, that marks her desire perverse. This feminine perverse desire for the lack of the phallus through this fantasy for the child is a return to both a steady and particularly reinforced love for the father. Dora, what does she have that I don't have? While the imaginary phallus is on the side of the mother, the premise of the phallus is on the side of the father. Another way to put this is if the mother is the girl's driver for her possession of the phallus, the father is the love object for his promise of the phallic gift. As Lacan notes, there was a contrast between the young homosexual woman's father and Dora's father. The former was a potent father, while the Dora's father impotent. Although it may not matter whether the father is impotent or potent or impotent, since the girl's fantasy is unconscious. Dora's case shows, as we will see, what happens when the father is incapable of producing a child in real life due to impotency. In his rereading of Dora from the perspective of the symbolic meaning of the gift exchange delineated by Claude Lévi-Strauss, Lacan introduces another instantiation of a feminine mode of perversion expressed as a steady and particularly reinforced love for the father. There are four major characters in Freud's report of his observation of Dora, whom he classified as hysteric. We all know this very well: father, her K, Frau K, and Dora. In contrast to the case of the young homosexual woman, where the mother gets real love from the father, that is the child. The mother here has no presence. In Dora's narrative, we see a quadruple relationship where two pairs of couples are formulated. And this is Lacan's reading. So father, Frau K on one hand, Dora, her K on the other. Concerning the former coupling, in Freud's observation, Dora held grudge against her father for loving the other woman. But from the outset, she hated Frau K, as it were, by way of inversion of her Oedipal grudge. Freud notes that Dora's dislike of Frau K was akin to the way in which a man feels jealousy in competition of love. So here we can notice an earlier trace of Freud's observation of Dora's homosexual tendency, which was missed during his initial treatment and case construction. He remarks, quote, "These masculine, or more properly speaking, gynecophilic currents of feeling are to be regarded as typical of the unconscious erotic life of hysteric girls," unquote. An ambiguity seen in Dora's relation to Frau K in his first pair cannot be missed when we look at the fact that Dora was an active, Freud says, active participant in father's secret love affair by doing some dutiful jobs on their behalf. An interpretation that Freud insisted upon in all authority, and that obviously was not well taken by the hysteric girl. But the truth is that, alluding to Freud, Dora did not seem to treat her rival, Frau K, with the animosity. Quite the contrary, she adored her. This peculiar behavior Dora showed toward Frau K, namely her homosexual bond, is precisely the riddle that Lacan tackles. In other words, Lacan tries to answer the following question: what does Dora's carefully curated homosexual attachment mean amid her apparent jealousy toward Frau K for stealing him, the father, when in fact father is impotent? This query seems to be even more important since, as Lacan reminds us, the stability of her illness was disturbed when the father's love affair stopped. Lacan explicates the enigma of the whole fourfold in three specific schemas. So the first diagram consists of Frau K, Dora, the father, on the parallel. So in this graph, Dora is positioned at the middle point between the two lovers, and her middle positioning is secured by the immediacy of the love between the father and Frau K, through which her satisfaction is actualized. Why then must her satisfaction be mediated? Dora can love only vicariously through this identification or homosexual identification, since she's hysteric. This mediacy is on the plane of imaginary, where she takes the same-sex subject as the object of love. Dora's case is, however, more complicated. She's not simply content with her homosexual attachment to Frau K, insofar as she wants the gift of love from the father. In fact, her frustration lies in the fact that the father cannot fulfill her real need due to his impotency. In other words, there's no intervention of the real child in Dora's case, unlike the case of the young homosexual woman. So the father's promise of the gift is impossible. Dora wants precisely this impossibility of the gift, as Lacan emphasizes, which of course renders her, again, desire unconscious. It's a critical point that marks Lacan's radicality in his formulation of a theory of the phallus. The impossible gift is the object in lack, which has the nothing. So in this logic, the impotency of Dora's father does and does not matter at the same time. So Freud pressed Dora on her insistent characterization of the love between the father and Frau K as an ordinary love affair. So Dora insists that their love affair is ordinary love affair, despite the father's impotency. And Freud pressed her to ask, how do you explain your father is a man without means? Dora admits that the father is a man without means, namely impotent, while maintaining her contention that love between them is an ordinary love affair. In this contradiction, young lady presented a rather sophisticated understanding of love, implying that genital discourse is not the only way to achieve sexual satisfaction. Quickly discerning that she was referring to other organs of the body, oral orifices, that can provide a sexual pleasure. Freud associated Dora's reference to her hysterical symptoms of coughing, throat problems, or aphonia. He thus attributed Dora's hysterical symptoms to infantile perversion, suggesting that this perverse sexuality is a sublimation of love. In some ways, at this moment, Freud already enunciated, perhaps without himself knowing, Lacan's articulation of feminine love as a mode of perversion. On the one hand, Dora's idea of love as such is a projection of her love for the father, since it cannot be sexual in a genital way, and we may recall the moral guilt delineated in the girl's beating fantasy in Freud. Insofar as the genitals are not involved, her love for the father can maintain itself, which is why his impotency is not an issue and perhaps even necessary. Concerning this necessity of the father's impotency, on the other hand, the father's impotency makes the whole situation even perfect for Dora. As a hysteric, since Dora cannot bear the idea of being the object of the other's desire, the father's impotency reaffirms her fantasy for the gift of the nothingness. And this is Veronique Rose. But what then is the problem to Dora? The problem is that in her eyes, the subject who receives this gift of the nothing is not herself, not even the mother, but another woman outside the family structure. Feeling betrayed by the father, her curiosity goes so far as to wonder, what is it that Frau K has that she does not have? In other words, What is it that my father loves in her beyond what I am? Let us keep in mind that her question was not that. What is it that Frauke loves about my father despite his impotency? That is not Dora's concern. From this point on, Dora begins to develop metaphysical questions about two subjects in particular, love and woman. She tells us what love is on one hand. That is, love is to love someone beyond what that person is. Her subsequent question concerns the ontology of women, namely, what is to be woman. In her mind, Frauke has the answers. Accessing her, she believes, is the solution to the question. Dora therefore recreates the triangular circuit that includes her K to have access to the position of Frauke. The second schema that Lacan reconstructs indicates this addition of her K as being linked to both Frauke and Dora simultaneously, while the original triangular relationship between the father, Frauke, Dora is still maintained. So you will see the original parallel is still maintained where there is her K connects to Frauke and Dora herself. So it is in this circuit that she received the symbolic gift. For that aim, the circuit must be maintained. One day, however, things radically changed. Dora experienced a crisis when her K declared his utter detachment to Frauke at the time of his attempt to kiss her by the lake, saying that, this is Freud, I get nothing out of my wife. At this moment, Dora slapped him. Both Freud and Lacan say that Dora's slap is not a note to his sexual advance, but in fact, she had been receiving his presence and taking walks with him until this time. But rather, in Lacan's rereading, for Dora, her case word nothing means, I have nothing on the side of my wife. This suggests that he does not desire Frauke. In Dora's translation, her case exclusion of Frauke means a remover of her from the structural circuit that she recreated. Therefore, Dora's slap is the sign of her aggression. Lacan says the passage to the act to her K for his breaking the circuit. This elimination of Frauke means, in Lacan's word, a fall in her identification with a lady, and more crucially, the exclusion of her existence from the symbolic structure. Hence, the impossibility of receiving the gift of love from the father, namely, no child. The premise of the father's gift shatters, and Lacan delineates this crisis in the final graph as follows. So Frauke is disconnected from Dora right here. So Lacan stresses that imply simply because a woman can receive the penis biologically to have a child, it does not mean that she is naturally endowed with a phallus, namely part of the symbolic structure. Lacan draws our attention to the position of a woman that Levi-Strauss problematizes in his theorizing of the structure of a kinship society. That is, a woman is reduced to the pure object. She is excluded from the symbolic organization. And this is precisely Dora's discontent, namely anguish. But when her K removes his wife from the circuit of desire, Dora finds herself being reduced to the pure object to be sold by the father. This shifts her status radically. She no longer occupies the place of the other's desire, but the very object of the other's desire. And at this point, her fantasy is in crisis, which unsettles her being. Dora hence starts to question her being as a woman. So my final section, feminine privation and perverse jouissance. So let us return to Lacan's assertion, perversion, namely a steady and particularly reinforced love for the father, a basis from which the formulation of my entire argument of this present talk is derived. Is Lacan here suggesting another discourse, namely the perverse discourse in the dialectical relation of the hysterics discourse and the master's discourse? is implying another type of jouissance, namely perverse jouissance. At this time of Lacan's teaching, his famous 4 discourses, the master, the university, the analyst, and hysteric, were not firmly established until his 17th seminar. Dora's quest for the knowledge about women was ultimately to gain the father's love, that is the phallus. The father, however, is doomed to fail to meet that demand of hers. He therefore gives her no thing. The achievement of her phallusization, in turn, the menstruation of the castration of the father. In Seminar 17, Lacan tells us that her exposing of the hysterics, exposing of the master's castration, which is the truth of the master, is the aim of the hysteric. The truth about the master can be, however, revealed only through the transmission of the knowledge about what is to be a woman via another woman, as seen in Dora. In other words, by way of avoiding her existence, which is why the hysteric cannot bear the idea of having the sexual body in front of the other's desire. Through this discourse of the lack which guarantees non-sexual rapport in the hysteric's discourse, the master is dominated or revenged. According to this sense, the young homosexual woman's suicidal fall from the railway bridge and Dora's various forms of somatic symptoms, including her imitation of the father's coughing, can be understood as their revenge by revealing the father's castration. It is the other side of an intensified feminine love for the father. Paradoxically, the hysteric's desire to be the lack is her acceptance of her privation. So she remains the spectral, like the female child who reduces herself to the pure surrounding of the beating sin, rather than being the real object of the other's love as a sexed body. The hysteric situates herself on the side of privation by accepting her impotence. She borrows the negative position of the mother endowed with by the father, albeit in a different register. The hysteric's goal is, however, not to receive the jouissance of the signifier that would bar her, namely phallic jouissance, but to be the signifier to castrate the father, a phenomenon that is not without jouissance. Only from this position of privation, the hysteric can pervert the phallic master to the castrated master. Discussed in this way, perversion thus requires feminine privation. Feminine privation is indispensable as far as Lacan is concerned for perverse love to be maintained and reinforced in both the position of the mother and the hysteric. In a purely speculative manner, could we say that Lacan invented a perverse discourse to support the hysteric's discourse based on feminine privation? Finally, the correlation of woman and the hysteric is undeniably and arguably established. What binds woman and the hysteric is precisely the deprived position endowed with both entities, the minus place in relation to the phallus in Lacan's algebraic system. As a woman always already unwritable, or outside within, or we can call it not all, the hysteric's desire to be the signifier of the lack is doubly impossible. But the effect of this double negativizing is positivizing, giving rise to namely perverse jouissance. It is through this double voiding that hysteric finds herself in the social link. She fabricates her own discourse, an act with anguish. This double impossible is a mode of hysterics being to obtain a steady and particularly reinforced love for the father, namely a feminine mode of perversion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Meera. That was very engaging, very thought-provoking. We're going to open things up to questioning, but as usual, I'm going to start the questions. Now, I wanted to start with a fairly broad question that sort of takes us back into some of the terms you're using. And in particular the term perversion itself, or perverse. Lacan has a curious habit of utilizing words while negating them at the same time, or negating words while continuing to use them. And the paradigmatic example of this, which you used a lot in your talk, is the phallus. So the phallus, Lacan is very clear when he uses the term phallus. He doesn't mean the biological organ, he doesn't mean the penis, the phallus in its conventional sense. And yet he insists on using the term phallus, which clearly has that connotation, and, you know, overtly or unconsciously is going to have that resonance with the meaning of phallus that it would have had before Lacan's insistence that by phallus he means something purely symbolic, or something non-biological. There seems to be something similar going on with the term perversion, that, you know, the term perversion prior to Lacan, prior to psychoanalysis, etymologically has that sense of turning away. It's difficult to get away from the moral tones in the word perversion, that to be perverse is to somehow be outside the norm, or abnormal, or even unnatural. You go back to the French perverse as a kind of sense of unnatural to it. So I wonder, my question for you is, why is it, do you think, having explored this with Lacan, why does he, following Freud, continue to insist on using a term when the connotations of that term cut so clearly against the arguments he's trying to make?
That's a very good question. I didn't think about the question why Lacan insists upon using the same word, and it is true, but he uses it in a completely different way, obviously. But that's a good question. I think Lacan wanted, well, that's the thing, Lacan really didn't have any seminar on perversion, for example, standalone seminar. But I think the word shows up very consistently and frequently. I think he himself was perhaps, I fantasize a little bit, struggling to really there's not one meaning of perversion in Lacan's teaching. In each seminar, it's different. But precisely, I wonder whether or not he himself was struggling how to talk about it, actually. But I think getting rid of the word perversion, I don't think that would have served this moral fixated meaning of perversion, because I think what Lacan was trying to do was in Kant with Sartre, precisely by linking to Kant. It's an imperative rather than it's the moral precinct, which is the opposite of it. It's a very interesting and somewhat perverse way to think about or deconstruct perversion. So I don't know why he insisted upon that. That's a great question. But I think because even though Lacan was trying to tell us something different aspect of perversion, there's something fundamental that's not entirely shifted away from Freud. So he couldn't get rid of the term. I mean, I'm just speculating, because there is a link between perversion and hysteria, which is what I was trying to do, the link there, the register of the link. It has to do, if he gets rid of perversion, the term perversion, he has to also get rid of, or cannot really talk about jouissance, substitutive satisfaction. Because in perversion, a traditional sense, it's all about the partiality of the organs of the body, right? So in perversion, any part of the organs of the body become or attached to this jouissance, substitutive satisfaction. So, for example, scopophilia, it's the sexual organ of one's own, right? It's autoerotic. But when it's reversed, it is the oneself looking her own sexual organ to be looked at. So it's a partiality, it's a partial drive. Fetishism, let's talk about food. It's like the word partiality. It substitutes the satisfaction. This partiality, substitutive satisfaction, also is the main feature of hysteria, convergent hysteria. Whereas cases, it can be the throat, the organ of the body. I think there is this connection that Freud made, and I think Lacan was quite while he was trying to move perversion from the libidinary economy that Freud formulated state to the level of, again, non-penis, which is the phallus, right? The samlang, and in connection to language. But also this, if he wanted to maintain jouissance as substitutive satisfaction, I think the term perversion from Freud, originated in the Freudian sense, must maintain itself. That is my very rough answer to your question.
That's a very, very good. It was a genuine question, not one I have an answer to myself. So it's really fascinating to hear your thoughts. I wonder then, as well, if we think of it in that sense and being slightly historical about it, the point when Freud is writing, the point where Lacan is writing, and then we think forward to the point where we are now. The term perversion tends to not necessarily have the denotation of homosexuality, but homosexuality always seems to enter into that conversation. So the examples that abound in Lacan and Freud and in your own talk tend to be around the notion of homosexuality, and our position in relation to homosexuality, the law and moralism has arguably, I don't want to be definitive about this, but seems to, in our culture, have shifted. That we're not in the same position we were at in, when Lacan was writing in the 1960s or even 1970s, or Freud much earlier than that. How does that affect our understanding of perversion? The fact that the contours have moved in the time between then and now.
Yes, I think it's a very important question in light of what is going on. The discourse of the sexuality and gender identity has been around. That is not the direction as it is shown that where I'm going with my work on perversion, although I am quite aware of that having to engage in this gender discourse these days, which has its own problems, I believe. But I wanted to, so it is true that Freud in particular, homosexuality, especially male homosexuality, was already in this polyamorous, right? Polyamorous perversion. But I think it at that point in Freud, there's no gender. I think it was polyamorous to any infant actually. So it was somewhat much later that it was more attached to male homosexuality, right? Something has to do with a feminine attitude. So even Freud, I think, when he linked perversion to male homosexuality, of course, he talked about the penis, the presence and absence of the penis. But already, I think what he calls feminine attitude, which is the different kind of psychic phallus that male subject has a relation to, is what gave rise to homosexuality. So I believe the homosexuality that Freud talked about in his work, even though in the time of the Victorian era, there was this moral judgment, as he said, it's not healthy, and etc. He did talk about always, in every moment, that's homosexuality that I think that we understand in the contemporary sense, which is the abnormal sexually engaging with the same sex organ, for example. I don't think that sexual activity with the same sex organ was what really Freud had in mind. At least that is my reading of Freud's idea of homosexuality. But to me, what makes the discourse of homosexuality in psychoanalysis interesting is the phallus. It's the position, it's the subject's relation to the function of the phallus, wherein the subject situates or places herself or himself in regards to the phallus is the sort of the point of reference, homosexuality or not, rather than actual penis or sexual activities with the organ. yes, I'll leave it at that.
No, that's very, very good. I could talk more, but I'm aware that other people want to ask you questions. You raised the question of gender identity there, which is also something I wanted to pick up, but I will come back if there's time at the end. But I'm going to let other people speak now. So first up, Mark.
Thank you. It's a wonderful talk, very detailed. And I'm wondering, what comes to mind is, it's been a while since I read it, but Bruce Fink's A Clinical Introduction to Lacan, and how he sketches distinction between, the movement of all of us, as I understand it, from through alienation and separation from the mother, in relation to the phallus and phallic signifiers and master signifiers, where psychotics have not crossed through alienation, perverts not crossed through separation, and then neurotics on most of us on that side. So I'm wondering how that relates to your exploration of perversion in Lacan, and especially perhaps Lacan's play on the word perversion, the father's version, and feminine jouissance beyond the phallus as well. I sense that those are circulating around your exploration, but I can't quite figure out how they relate.
Yes, thank you. That's a wonderful illustration of Bruce Fink's elucidation and the question. It's a big question, so I tried to answer as best as I could in a succinct way. I think what's interesting about, I got interested in perversion quite whimsically during the COVID lockdown. What could I do? So I don't understand what perversion is. I try to figure out with my friends and colleagues. It's fun because precisely we can talk about it so much. In other words, neurosis and psychosis, we know the structure. We can't, let's say it's not foreclosure or psychosis. We can't say that, right? But perversion, we can say all kinds of things. Also because unlike psychosis, perversion is a sort of it's in the popular culture. It's in our popular culture. So anybody can, even lay people can talk about perversion. Whereas I don't think the lay people can talk quite readily about psychosis or schizophrenia, right? So that's part of interesting about perversion. At the same time, it's because of that, it is also very challenging to talk about very one clear thing. But what you're describing, the Bruce Fink's beautiful elucidation, is one of the moments that I listed in the beginning of my talk, which is the triadic, the mother, father, the phallus, which happens in the second phase of the three phases of the Oedipus complex that Lacan elucidated. And in Bruce Fink's, there disavowal was the very important psychic mechanism, right? That disavowal of the phallus, and the phallus is the mother's desire. The male child wants to be that phallus to make the mother satisfied, until he realizes that, I'm not the one that she loves me, right? It's someone else, the father, the other big man, right? If the child doesn't overcome that second phase, when the father names to the mother, naming of her leg, right? You don't have this, you need this, right? You want that or that. When the child doesn't realize that mother's leg, that's when the child turns to sort of the phase of perversion, right? So that is very different kind of perversion that I delivered, the talk that I delivered today. Although I think still, for me, this thing called the phallus is very important. So another speculation is that what Lacan was trying to do here, was he trying to really, really clarify perversion? Was he trying to tell us more about the phallus, the function of the phallus, the importance of the phallus. If the phallus is then not a real organ, a sexual organ, anatomical organ, but it's a semblant, right? Something like phallus, then that perversion in Joyce's case, which could be many other things that substitute the father. In other words, the other kind of father figure that can name the lack of the subject. Many versions of the father. In Joyce's case, was writing, right? So while there are distinctive moments of the instance of perversion in Lacan's work. However, I think we can also make some connection for me through the function of the phallus, the function that substitutes the biological father, the biological penis. That is something I can see in all different moments of Lacan. Hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Do we have other questions on the floor? Okay, if we don't, you mentioned earlier the idea of, you brought in the idea of gender identity, and this being something culturally, there has been that shift. It's a big question now. And before you did that, it's something I wanted to ask you in relation to the end of your talk, where you're talking about Dora and the question of what is a woman. And this question, which we get through the Dora story, we get through Freud, we get through Lacan, and disconnected or unconnected from that, it's a question that seems to be very very prevalent in our society at the moment. I don't know how things are, particularly in the United States or in New York, but certainly where I am, it's a big question. I think most people in the Lacanian world will have been reading about what's going on in Scotland because of Zizek's recent article on wokeness, and he relates some of the let's say scandal that's been going on here around gender identity. I don't think Zizek relates it terribly well. He's not terribly accurate, but he gets something of the story out there. And this question of, or a slightly different way, a lampooning of the question, what is a woman, seems to have become a cultural motif at the moment. Again, how could people possibly not know what a woman is? And yet we, long before this particular scandal, we in the Lacanian world have been quite accepting for a very long time that the question of what is a woman remains central and remains enigmatic. There's not really a question there, more of an observation, but I wonder if I can pass the observation over to you. How does, having talked about this question, I really like the way you situate perversion as a point articulated to the hysteric and therefore articulated to the feminine position. And I wonder how that reflects then on the cultural debate that's going on at the moment with the competing cultural notions of what it is to be a woman, and very unresolved competing notions of what it is to be a woman.
Yes, maybe what is woman is not only hysteric's question. Perhaps it is everyone's question these days, right? And here the woman, perhaps in this contemporary question of what is woman, is perhaps not only the one natural woman, by which I mean woman with natural genitalia, but also there's subjects who are, again, if you think more specifically the cultural sense, the trans, right? People who are in between, people who have changed or completed that process of trans, or also even psychical feminine position, not a natural woman. And this question, what is a woman, is not only questioned by women, let alone the hysteric, not only the question by the women, but question by the society. So it is true. It is true. I mean, in Freud's case, the woman was very sort of archaic. It was very sort of Greek question, right? The woman was a woman has to do with castration and fundamentally have to give a child. That's why I think the niederkommen, the word was very important when Lacan was really taking it in to his reading of Freud. But we can't talk about what is woman only from that perspective anymore, because there's a natural woman, there's a trans woman, there's a psychic woman, right? So from that perspective, the psychoanalysis has a limitation. There's a limit that psychoanalysis, in current discourse of psychoanalysis, cannot take all for account for. I don't know what else to say, but does it mean that psychoanalysis can be abandoned to attempt to take account for what's happening, the differences? And I think we still can, because for me, it is about the position. It's about the positioning of the subject. In other words, I think that what is woman is no longer a hysterics question, but even being a woman or not woman, or what does he or she want from me, is also questioned by the person who's going through the process of transgender. And I don't see that what is woman, the question of what is woman, is necessarily or always synonymous with what is my gender. I think these are two different things. Perhaps if I have some thinking about the contemporary discourse of gender in a cultural domain, is that I think people tend to conflate this question of what is woman from a psychoanalytic perspective with gender politics or gender identities in a traditional sense. But I don't think they're the same. Perhaps for that difference, I think psychoanalysis has had something to contribute to.
No, that's a very good point. I agree with you completely. I think psychoanalysis, and particularly a Lacanian version of psychoanalysis, has an enormous amount to contribute. Starting from the very simple point that Lacan understood that identity is considerably more complex than a whimsical choice of, I will be this, I will be that, or even the very fact that identity is problematic, that identity is always identification, it's always a process, not a state. So I think Lacan's work, or psychoanalysis, is very well positioned to intervene. I think that's a really important point you bring in there, that the question of an identity and the question of a definition are actually two separate questions, and
yes,
equally important but separate at the same time.
Yes, I think the separation has to be made very clearly, because all this gender discourse is about identity. It's about identity politics. So precisely what psychoanalysis does is to desubjectify, right? Just to work through the identification. So I think that is the most, contentious or challenging part between these two questions and different non-differentiation.
Yeah. I wonder, you said at the outset that the piece you presented to us today is it's part of a work in progress from a larger piece of work around the superego. And yet you didn't really mention the superego in your talk. I wonder where does the superego come into this?
That's right. This chapter is in the part where I talk about the prohibiting father. So I think there are two kinds of cruelty in the superego. As I was doing research, continue my research on it, and the superego question to me is I link to what is the father, what is a father, and there is a prohibiting father in a traditional sense, but also there's a permitting father, permitting father. I think Dora's case, or these two cases here, is what happens when the father doesn't permit the love, right? So another way that I think about what is hysteric in woman, even though there is overlapping, if we create the diagram, I think there's a section that it overlaps. And another way to think about the distinction between love and hysteric, if there is, and I think there is the distinction between love and desire. So what does father can give? In other words, I link the question of woman, the position of woman to desire. That's via the mother's desire, right? So in its father's prohibition, right? And for me, hysterics position has to do with love, what I talked about today. That is, again, the prohibiting father. The father doesn't allow the love, right? So this section is under that kind of framework.
Okay, yeah, no, makes sense. I think, Mark, you got your hand up again, so I'm going to move over and let someone else's voice in. Mark.
Oh, sure. I was waiting for others to join in as well, but what you're discussing is really helpful, I think, because regarding identity politics, there's the problem of, declaring one's trans identity or whatever the pressures of the current debate require, even at a very young age, or having, that ability taken away. Here in the U.S., there are laws being passed against it, and even with surgery too, to adjust the body. But you're, I think, exploring or at least making clear to me how a Lacanian view involves deconstructing, if one uses that term, even a trans identity, or even along with masculine, feminine, so that we're all on a continuum. We're all in process in our lives in relation to the primal mother experience and various versions of the phallus and our objects of desire and fantasies along the way, which change throughout our lives. And so it's really interesting and I think helpful that you're exploring this. And again, I'm wondering how, Lacan's, I think, rather late gesture to feminists that about a jouissance beyond the phallus might play a role also. Do you see the current debates over identity politics regarding gender opening up more possibilities for varieties of gender, not within the Lacanian order even? Because, again, thinking back to Bruce Fink's, what I found very helpful, mapping of psychosis, perversion, and neurosis, where hysteria would also be on the neurotic side, after separation as well as alienation from the mother through relation to the patriarchal order, symbolic order. That also was written, as I understand, to help clinicians to define patients when they came in.
Yes.
And because he argues that one has to treat the psychotic structure very differently, and true pervertic structured people don't usually come to the clinic. So it's a distinction often between is this patient neurotic or psychotic. But again, if those are viewed as layers within us, rather than fixed identities,
Yes.
or identities that we find as a true identity, which is part of the politics now of the trans debate, excuse me. It becomes more nuanced and flexible. So is that what you're exploring also, the problematics of our current gender politics, even with the debate, challenging notions of heteronormative or male-female binaries?
Thank you. That's very wonderful, actually. I think you said it more nicely than I could have. No, that is not what I am exploring in my book. Nonetheless, I think I'm glad that my current work is sort of provoking this kind of conversation. I think that's what I see, and I think that makes me really happy. Whether this current gender politics or identity politics proliferate the discourse of psychoanalysis, especially in the clinic, I believe that it's happening. It has happened. It is happening. That is absolutely yes. Do I believe, or would I like to believe that cultural happening would affect the clinical structure of psychoanalysis that have been established? I don't know yet. I don't know. But I think clearly this many proliferated forms of gender identity makes the clinic much more interesting, but also challenging, but interesting. That is true. But still, for me, though, whether a trans person or has completed with a trans, or even a man or woman without a trans, still could ask the question, what is to be a woman? That is what I return to. This is not an identity question. That is a question of the desire. So whatever gender you assign yourself to, this question, it's a question of the desire, not the question of what is my gender box. So, however, as a clinician, the ways in which the one has to conduct the analysis, I think, has to be something that perhaps psychoanalysis can further develop, I think, in the technique, in terms of technique. But this is how I also want to think about perversion. I said that in the beginning, I sort of disclaimer, this talk is not about clinical diagnosis and etc., because then again, it goes just all over the place. But it's not my original idea, obviously, but whether we could consider perversion not as a structure, right? It's as if there is a clear structure like a psychosis and neurosis. So there is a formulation and we can treat the patients in this way or direct the treatment in this way and this way. But rather that it's a transitory, it is a ephemeral, transitory, it's a structure in a way, but it's a transitory phenomena, clinical phenomena that helps clinician to direct the treatment. And because perversion, in the early works of Lacan, it's connected to neurosis, right? But also specifically to hysteria as well. But in Lacan's later teaching, and also if we look at Schreber's case, feminine position, feminine jouissance is also in the structure of psychosis, delusion, right? Erotomanic delusion, etc. So perversion can be seen or appear in all so-called three clinical structures. It is in that sense, I think perversion, that's what I find perversion very interesting, because it can provoke many, not only theoretical, but clinical implications and conversations. So that's what I think, that the connection between contemporary gender identity discourses and perversion, how does that make clinic more interesting and challenging? Because it's not just linked to neurosis or hysteria, or it could link to all of these. So maybe perversion is a new sort of phenomenon new transitory phenomenon or structure that that makes clinics more interesting or actually helpful as well.
It's interesting. That kind of links with my opening question about the etymology as well. I guess that perversion, etymologically speaking, is to turn away, and it has that indirect sense of it that the pervert, the one who is perverse, has been turned away. So you can see that kind of very direct connection there with the direction of the treatment to turn the analysand, or to help the analysand be turned.
Yes, that's a good point. Yes, that's right. That's right. Yes. I mean, we talk really more concretely how to treat the pervert, right? And in analytic moments that, perverts always make the other anxious, right? Through the kind of erotomanic gaze and etc. So how does the analyst turn that gaze away, right, from this moment? So yes, it is very, very interesting, and that could be the question for neurotic. That could be the question for the psychotic as well, and hysteric as well. But yeah.
Wonderful. Meera, I'm going to ask you a slightly unrelated question. It's a question I'd like to ask our guests, and sometimes don't have time to. What are you reading? What should we be reading?
Oh my God. Is that a real question, or is
yes.
I'm not reading anything really interesting and not reading anything real. I'm reading Lacan related. So recently I'm reading a few different things. What am I looking at here? That's the most difficult question that I've got today from you. Yeah, I've just got a new copy, Zizek Responds. So I haven't read a chapter, but I just got a new copy. So that's one thing on my list. I'm kind of sort of going back to Badiou's Lacan as well. I'm also reading some of Jacques Miller's lectures on delusion and psychosis. So I'm sorry, I'm really boring.
Not boring at all. And sorry, I really put you on the spot there. The Zizek Responds is a good call. I've just received a copy myself, so like you, I've not had an opportunity to read it yet, but it does look fascinating. But what's also fascinating has been your talk tonight. It's been a real pleasure hosting you. It's been real food for thought, very stimulating, lots of ideas that's got me thinking, and I think will have me thinking for some time, which is exactly what we like from these talks. So thank you very much for coming along and talking to us.
Thank you for hosting the event again, and thanks everyone for staying. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming. And we will be back at the end of next month, the end of April, and Eve Watson will be talking to us at the end of April. So last Thursday of April, please be there. See you then. Take care.